think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming out today. I'm Beth Stryker. I'm the director of the MAK Center for Art and Architecture. Most of you will be familiar with us, but we are a satellite of the MAK Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. Here in Los Angeles, we steward and program 3 historic sites designed by the Austrian-American architect R.M. Schindler. So here at the Schindler House, we do a year-long program of exhibitions and presentations. At the Mackey Apartments in Mid-City, we host artists and architects in residence, and we have our next cohort joining us on April 1st. And then at the Laurel Canyon site, the Fitzpatrick Leland House, we host an annual researcher in residence program that's in partnership with the SOM Foundation, and we will be launching a new reading room and resource center. And today we're really pleased to have with us Neville Wakefield and Hilton Als. I'm going to do very, very brief introductions. Neville Wakefield, I'll start with you. And there's obviously much more that could be said, but I think I want to leave time for you all to hear from these two. Neville is a postmodern writer and curator interested in exploring the ways in which art behaves outside of institutional contexts. Neville is the curator of the current exhibition here on view, Helmut Lang, What Remains Behind, and he is also the founding artistic director of Desert X, which is currently on view throughout the Coachella Valley, and if you can make it, I encourage you to go see that. Hilton Als is a critically acclaimed, award-winning curator, critic, and journalist. He has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1994, and is currently a teaching professor at the University of California, Berkeley. So I think with that, we will have time for questions after the conversation, and we also hope you all will join us for the reception to follow. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
I think it'll be better for if I hold it. Is that okay? It's just it's the Shaka Khan in me. I want to hold the mic. This is Neville. Thank you so much for sending me a sweet email about inviting me here. And this is a whole new world for me. I didn't know anything about the Schindler House, and I had not seen Helmut's artwork before you wrote to me. And my email back was something like, I'm so ashamed, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. And then Neville sent me some very beautiful writing about Helmut's art. And so as I started to look at things, I became more and more engrossed by the combination of this extraordinary, the house feels, I just have to say it, the house feels like a vessel to me, something that is going to sail away. And simultaneously there's Helmut's imagination, which sails in many different directions at once. And so I wanted to ask you, how did this cohabitation happen?
Okay.
It's okay.
I don't think I can do that. Well, it was an invitation from Helmut, primarily. Obviously, Helmut had been invited by the MAK, and you know, this house to me is the gem of Los Angeles architecture. It's something of a hidden gem. And what was, I think, really interesting is that most of my work tends to be site-specific, and I often think about not an abnegation of curatorial responsibility, but I do think about the way that place connects as curator, particularly in say, the desert. And what was really I mean, first of all, this place is so obviously not a white cube. It's not what Crow called context of no context. It's as you said, a vessel, replete with human history and experimentation and dialogue and all those other things. And the idea of of combining Helmut's work, I mean, obviously we have 2 Austrians.
I have to tell you something that I completely blanked on the Austrian connection, thinking about Helmut because he's been in America so long. Yes, go ahead.
And thinking about the way that a place can frame a dialogue. And what was really interesting is that none of these sculptures were made with the Schindler House in mind.
Wow.
They're all they're extant sculptures. And yet there's been an incredible dialogue, I think, between the two. And perhaps, it's a dialogue between two surrogates,
Yes.
if you want. And I think about what we could go back to your and my inspiration. We tell ourselves stories in order to live.
Yes.
And this is a place full of stories. And Helmut sculptures are also a place full of stories.
They are. I mean, one of the things that was so astonishing to me when I came when I came by yesterday, and I spent, I sort of couldn't leave. Actually, is what happened. One of the things that was so extraordinary to me about the work was how it seemed as if there was some sort of illumination coming from the sculpture out into the rooms, which are fairly dark rooms. And I didn't know, and I didn't want to know until I spoke to you, what the materials were that interested Helmut in terms of making these particular works. And then I'll sort of get into his earlier work. But there was a way in which light figured much more greatly in this work than it had in the past, in terms of the work that I had seen. Do you know what he was using here?
Yeah, I mean, there is a sort of internal luminescence to both the wax pieces that are the wall works, although he wouldn't call them wall works. I think you'd still see them as sculptures, but also these ones, which are made of actually of foam. So all the material that he uses, at least in this, has had a life before, and particularly with the foam, it has the impress of human history on it.
Yes.
The human stain.
Yes, exactly.
And
You want to get in or out of that bed, you can't decide.
and so I think that was one of the really interesting things was how. And one of the things that fascinates me is what happens to architecture when people leave it, when it's no longer inhabited, and when the ghosts of its habitation sort of take over. And I think there's a similar feeling to some of the works in here. They bear the scars of their making.
Yes.
You can see the foam has been compressed and bound, and then sometimes sort of herniates out of little bits.
Yes.
and expands. And in a similar way, you can see the impress of the making of the building, the imperfections on the slabs,
Yes.
but also the presence of this human architecture that inhabited it. And of course, this was as well as a formal experiment, I think it was a social experiment. It was an experiment in new ways of living and new types of even promiscuity, and how do you break these conventions that bind us into rooms and into boxes and into institutions, including perhaps even marriage and stuff. So that kind of idea that things spill out of their containers, or however much you try to contain them and compress them, they're sort of hemorrhaging outwards, and the idea that we're always negotiating a threshold of interior and exterior space, which is obviously particularly relevant here, where the architecture is literally designed to let the outside in.
And I think that one of the things that was very clear to me when I was walking through the rooms, and I started to feel that I was living in real science fiction, that the feeling that science fiction gives us generally is gives me the feeling that I'm the pod, right, sitting in the audience, waiting to explode or be killed or die in some way. But the feeling in these rooms was that my body was going to assume a new shape because of the sculpture, the combination of the sculptures and the ceilings. I mean, if you're a tall person, you have to sort of bend down and have a different relationship to the space than if it was, a white cube, in Chelsea. And so one of the things that fascinates me is the juxtaposition of the sculptures with the materials of the walls. That's a significant thing. In fact, we're sitting in front of the idea of shelter being something that was solid and temporary at the same time. Helmut's work is not time-based, but I feel that he's interested in the erosion of time in the sculptures as well. Do you have that sense?
Definitely, and some of his sculptures he'll leave outside, and he's quite happy to sort of accelerate the entropy and embrace entropy as part of the working process. But I think also there are different registers of time, which we feel very strongly here. There's the historical time and architectural time and sculptural time, and they're all kind of dialoguing with one another in some way. And then there's this future time as well, which is maybe
Which is science fiction.
Which is the science fiction time.
Yes, yes.
But there's something very interesting about the scale of the house, which I think the sculptures bring out, and particularly the pieces that are the vertical pieces, which are titled fists. And when we see them in photographs, they look human scale, and then there's a sort of being John Malkovich effect that we suddenly come into the house and actually they're not. So
Yes.
so I think one of the things that's interesting is this kind of concertinaing of both time and space. And
Yes. I felt in terms of the science fiction aspect, in terms of the collaboration, I remembered that moment in Eraserhead when they see the baby, and the baby is just this kind of squirming thing, and I felt, and you feel deep sympathy for the baby, and you feel completely
repulsed at the same time.
repelled at the same time. And I think that in looking through Helmut's work, I think he loves this scale between something that is seductive and repellent simultaneously. I wanted to ask you, this is something that you said in 2008 in a dialogue with Helmut. I know, sorry. I was digging. And one of the things that you talk about are the surfaces. And you start to compare them to relationships, that they are something that can be cast off or embraced. And he says, oh, actually, Neville, it can also offer you protection. And I thought that was fascinating.
Right.
And so, are these totems totems that protect us or look over us, or are they taboos that made manifest, do you think?
I think they're both, actually. I think Helmut is completely non-descriptive about how these pieces get interpreted. He's not evasive. He's just generous in the sense of giving us the right to interpretation and not prescribing it. But yeah, I think they're both. I think they're born of a struggle to externalize internal form. The floor-based pieces are titled prolapse, so you've already got the idea of the body as a container not being able to contain itself and spilling out.
Expelling.
Which is both, a repulsive and beautiful idea.
Yes.
The externalization of the internal. And I also started thinking about them in terms of, someone like Matthew Barney's Drawing Restraint
I was thinking of that.
series, where
I was thinking more about Matthew swimming in the shit, actually. In that,
the River of Fun
yes,
as
yes,
well.
yes.
But the Drawing Restraint series was a series that he did where he would attach himself to various kinds of elasticated tether in an effort to make that would hinder the process of drawing. So it was an idea of defeating the facility for drawing and making it more difficult, therefore internalizing a sort of biological condition.
Yeah.
I
And
do
is
think
it also a way of earning the drawing?
yeah, I think
Yeah,
it was,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I think maybe there's an analogy there with Helmut. I don't necessarily think it's biological, but I think maybe it's more psychographic, psychological, psychographic. But this idea of wrestling with material until it takes a form. He talks about it. He talks about leaving the sculptures at a point at which they have a life of their own.
When I was walking around, one of the things that I love about sculpture is that it forces us to walk in a different way in a room or space. And one of the things that was very clear to me in reading some of the literature around him, and I don't know why people pussyfoot around this aspect, but there was a little catalog. Someone was talking about Belle de Jour, and someone else was talking about an aspect of the body and so on. But I felt energized by the sexual energy of the pieces, and I know that creativity and sexuality go hand in hand, but it feels to me that when I'm in the space with the work, I feel that I'm with the most ardent lover I didn't know. And he's pushing me against the wall to sort of make a point. And so, where is he? But there's, I felt that the work wasn't aggressive in that way, but it was very knowledgeable about the body and other people's bodies. And that might have something to do with the past and working as a designer, but I think it's different here. He's not working with something that moves, he's working with something that has to stay.
Right, and I think, yeah, I mean, as much as fashion can be a sort of sentient skin, I think something else is going on here. It's very hard to pin down what the kind of sexual energy of these works is for me, but it's definitely there. And I mean, there's a piece in the nursery which is more kind of more self-explanatory in the sense that it's a phallic kind of element pulled out of another sculpture. But I think the interesting side of it is, I mean, Freud had all that stuff about our first creative act being manipulation of our own feces and all that kind of stuff, but I think that...
Not on my mother's watch, but...
Yeah.
Clean that up!
Yeah. But I think there is something sort of innately sexual in the manipulation of this material. I don't really...
I mean,
I'd be intrigued to know what how you would articulate
well, it was...
that, 'cause I'm clearly failing.
No, you're not failing, it's just homo. It's just a different thing, Neville. But I feel that it speaks to me being confronted by another gay man, and that one of the things that you're taught very early on is to kind of hide it and to be ashamed on some level, that you don't want to sort of let people know who you are completely,
Right.
because you'll be attacked or whatever. And so when you walk into these rooms and not knowing that much about him at all, before this week and reading quite a bit, I realized that the earlier works were way more opaque. The works that you were talking to him about in 2008 and so on, when he started making work. But now the atmosphere was so much more sort of out there and forthright in terms of not making an apology about that kind of energy. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the earlier work, but one person who occurred to me in terms of materials was Eva Hesse. I was wondering
Right.
if he was a fan of that work.
I actually don't know. I mean, obviously, when I think about it, I think about more Chamberlain, for instance,
Mhm.
and those crunched materials,
Yes.
but also Louis Bourgeois.
Yes.
I would think. And there's a plasticity and animation to this work. I think that was not so present in the earlier work.
Yeah.
I think that, for those of you who may not be so familiar, really the first body of art that he produced was largely made out of his archive, which he shredded as an act of perhaps rejection of the past, or transformation of the past at least. And it was then sort of set in epoxy resins, and the series is called "Make It Hard."
Wow.
I think, if
That's funny, yes.
correct in recalling, but it was both hard and obdurate and opaque in a way that these new works aren't, because they do capture the light. They do transform as you move around them, as you engage with them in different ways, in different heights, and all this stuff. So.
I'm curious, what were this idea that you've introduced that is fascinating in terms of how space as the sort of curatorial eye. What was it? I wanted to know what drew you initially to the work, even because it was less dramatic, and it was much more sort of, to me, pulled back than the work he's doing now. And I'm interested in what you saw in the mystery of the early work that drew you to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was more process driven.
Okay.
And so I think and again, this is me speculating, because I don't think Helmut would ever say this, but a process in the sense of processing the past and processing the immediate past, and his long and extraordinary career as a designer. I mean, I think these works are also about processing the past, but perhaps it's a more personal,
A more immediate,
and possibly traumatic.
yes, yes.
Because some of them do feel that, particularly the prolapse pieces, they do feel like sites of trauma in some ways.
Yes.
And
Yes. Or the remains of trauma,
Or,
when,
yeah.
like a crime scene,
Or-
right?
yeah.
A crime
Yeah.
scene when something is left. Speaking of family trauma, I wanted to ask you about your family. We all have that. We all have it. But one of the things that, in terms of reading about, well, let me just say, I think that you're a great curator, and like all great curators, you're interested in telling a story on some level. And I was very interested when I was reading about you to know that your dad was a potter, and that you basically grew up outside with your sisters. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience of living with an artist? And I know this is like agony for a British person, but
I completely
but,
I mean,
but 5 minutes.
He was doing the Freudian thing, literally manipulating the black pieces. But my father was an artisan, not an artist.
Yes.
And I grew up in a sort of neo-hippie environment. It was pretty feral. It was on a very remote island where we didn't have access to very much at all. So
There was no car, but there was a donkey cart.
God,
I know.
you've gone deep.
Yes, I have. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And are your sisters older than you?
Yeah, they're all older.
Yeah.
So obviously I bear that,
Yes.
into therapy with me.
We
as
have
well.
parallel experiences because Neville has, is it 2 or 3? 3, and I have 4 older sisters, so that explains how kind we are to women.
Sometimes to a fault.
Yes, exactly. We never contradict women. But so what was that like in terms of you understanding when you went out into the world? Was your interest in art fostered by that experience of your dad? And
No, I think it was more. I think it was fostered more by growing up in a place of confinement, and actually a place of great physical freedom. We were 50 miles offshore, but we'd sail boats wherever we wanted and do things that I'd never let my children do. But great social constrictions. So I think art became a language which I could negotiate, could somehow negotiate between those two things. Those ideas of physical expansiveness and freedom and social constriction.
yes, yes. No, I get it. I was actually, that was something that I wanted to ask you, because in reading through things, I wanted to ask you, do you think that the work you're much drawn to verges on on sort of crossing out the definitions of public art, things on a wall, etc.? Were those distinctions irritating to you as you began to understand what you wanted to do as a curator?
I don't know whether they're irritating. I think it was more this idea of working in a controlled environment. And the environment I grew up in was never controlled, so that was an anathema for me. But there's a kind of curating where you're trying to eliminate every variable. There's climate control. You can't touch, you can't engage. There's an architectural barrier. There's usually an economic barrier, and there's also an ontological barrier, because you kind of go into this white space, and without a certain knowledge of art, it doesn't make sense. So I was interested in what happens if you remove those barriers. And in a funny way, I think that feeds into the exhibition here, because it really, in the broadest sense, is a dialogue between interior and exterior space.
Yes.
Whether that's characterized as architecturally or at a human level psychologically, that seems to be the primary dialogue.
I think that just as a viewer, I recognized it almost at once, because my first experiences with art had a lot to do with not understanding what was happening, because it was in an institution or whatever. And at this very early, I was one of those kids who, cut school to a museum, not knowing what the museum was or what the show was. And I remember it, and I had this feeling here in terms of the vessel idea and being in a kind of uncharted territory. I walked into the Museum of Modern Art. This is when it was very small, and they had docents, nice ladies who would walk around, and I grew up in a family of ladies, so I don't have any problem going up and saying, "You're a nice lady, will you talk to me?" And there was a goat in the middle of the floor, and the goat had paint splattered on it and had a tire around it, and it was on a platform. And I didn't understand anything about it at all, except that something told me to keep looking. And a lady was giving a tour, and I remember she was standing near a bed, Rauschenberg's bed, and I looked, and I said, I don't understand. And she said, if you come back at 3, truly this was the Museum of Modern Art then, but I know it's mind-blowing to think about, but she said, if you come back at 3 tomorrow, I'll talk to you about it. And she did, and I did, and she did. And she said, when he was little, he had a goat, and his father shot the goat. and all of these things, and that art can be whatever you
So,
decide.
makes sense.
What you decide. And I remember it was sort of like my head, because there was maybe 5 sentences, but suddenly there was something to hold on to. And I think what I'm saying is that when you wrote to me about Helmut's work, and just this afternoon, there's the combination of my desire to connect, and then there's also your curatorial expertise that helps me with the adhesion. So, thank you. But I also wanted to ask, but I wanted to also ask you, do you feel like a teacher when you do this kind of work, that you're exposing folks to things that they might not have known before?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Because I don't think it's didactic. I'd hate to
Okay.
be didactic. I mean, I'd hope that inadvertently, you'd arrive at some exposure
Yes.
like that. I mean, I do think that with a lot of the more public stuff, such as the work in the desert, the audience is not an art or savvy audience, and that's one of the beauties of it, and seeing particularly children understanding the work in their own way and realizing that they could also do it
Yes.
is perhaps the most rewarding side of that. And not even do it, but just think in that way.
And to be free in the mind in that way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I remember, I was always too scared to go into Mary Boone's gallery. But
Why? Did she scare you?
It's terrifying.
Yes.
But she had a name. The window was etched, but she had a name,
Yes.
in clear.
Yes.
And I always try to look at
Yeah.
it.
Yes. I don't think she would be explaining much.
Maybe not.
No. One of the things that I, again, wanted to ask you about, and I know it's agony for you, but I think the people would like to know. When you started doing the curatorial work at Desert X, how did that come about? How did that experience come about?
I mean, fundamentally, I was invited to do it. I was doing other site-specific shows, such as one in Switzerland, Elevation 1049, which I did with Maya Hoffman, and was just interested in the way that art behaves in these uncontrolled environments, and particularly how the lack of control can be part of how the work can collaborate with these circumstances that it isn't controlling. Whether it's nature, whether it's the wind, whether it's the snow, but the idea that it then has a life of its own. And I think it's all the stuff that we know about the museum and the etymology of museum and mausoleum and all that stuff, good stuff that was written about in the 80s and 90s. But I think the idea that art can, whether it's leaving the moment which it leaves Helmut's hands or the moment it goes out into the public, that it has a life of its own, and it's an uncontrollable and often unmanageable life, and that's what makes it exciting.
I mean, one of the things that's so generous to me about your curatorial practice is that you have worked with some pretty strong-willed people. I generally prefer them to be dead, so that I don't have to hear that and do my thing. But you are working with, people who are changing the landscape in a lot of ways. Do you like that form of collaboration with the artist?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it tests you in the same way that the result hopefully tests the audience, and that's really important. Yeah, I think it's a question of having multiple lives, and that there's a moment with the artists that has its own dynamic, and then the work adopts that and lives in its world.
Does it inspire you to make work outside of the curator practice?
This is enough. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm curious to ask you about,
They're all dead.
Well, going back to the Lydian stuff,
Sure.
as writers and as artists and possibly as curators, we do create narratives. We
Yes.
do tell stories in order to live. So,
Yes, we do.
how does that feed into
You
your
mean my thing?
Yeah,
Um,
because you're all of those things.
I think that one of the things that I love about it is that they've initiated the conversation through their work. They're there with you. And one of the things that would happen in the meetings was that I would just start reading her aloud and say, oh, this is so great that, it's never really been hit on how much work she was doing, anti-discriminatory work she was doing in Hawaii. And she would say that I could pass. And so that the owner of the plantation or wherever I was would just speak freely about a place where he had no business being in the first
Right.
place. So that experience was a great one in terms of Annie Philbin, for sure, making it this kind of safe space. I think that for me, it comes down from the administration sort of taking care of us.
Right.
So that we can create, and it's not just about paying bills, but about being in concert with your ideas. I was also fortunate in that Joan wrote me letters giving me permission and saying, I don't want to cry, but she says, your show will be beautiful, of course it will be beautiful. And so when you walk into a space and you have the love and support of someone, the way that Helmut supports you in this venture of the Schindler House, etc., you experience a kind of freedom because love should be freeing as opposed to constraining. And so I felt, and often when I'm doing a show, if I don't have the feeling of love, I don't do it.
Right.
Because it's a long time to spend with someone,
Right.
whether they're living or dead. And it's also a long time for you to, it's very akin to reporting, and what Deanna Arvis said about, she said, I don't arrange the subject, I rearrange myself to suit the subject. So that's why I don't think you could do a show that's this graceful of Helmut's things without rearranging yourself.
There was a lot of
Yeah. And so that's what I felt too, looking at the show yesterday, was how much you had, that it was a very graceful exposition because you had let him have this new chapter of being much more sort of forceful and out there.
Well, and also just it was such a joy and honor to actually spend, nearly a week, just in this space with these objects,
Yes.
trying to find arrangements that made some sort of sense
Yes.
to someone or other.
Yes.
And I'm curious, going back to the narrative thing and the compulsion to draw a narrative out of potentially inanimate objects, should I
Yes.
say.
And how do they speak? How do they speak?
And how do they, and what the narratives are that you drew out of your experience here yesterday?
In this show?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think that it goes back to where's my boyfriend? No, it's it goes back to this feeling that Helmut has done something here that's quite extraordinary in terms of pushing the viewer, drawing the viewer in and then pushing the viewer against the wall to really look at the work and to look at the force of the work. I think that sculpture is so fascinating and I love it generally because I don't know what my relationship will be to it when I walk in.
Well, it's a negotiation.
Yeah, always.
relationship.
and it depends on exactly what you were talking about, where we are, what the weather is, etc. There were some beautiful women here yesterday, and who were very reverential about the space and about the sculptures, and I kind of followed them a little bit to see what they were seeing, and then I broke away, and then I saw and felt what I felt, which was I was in the company of something that was deeply emotionally extravagant, and you had helped not contain it, but you had helped position it for the viewer to have whatever feeling. My feeling was that it was deeply sexual and emotional, and that he was having his way with me as a viewer. Yeah. Yeah, against the law. I keep bringing that up. I don't think it's a bad to say out loud, but
They're good walks.
yeah, exactly.
And I think, yeah, I mean, I think thinking about that, the other aspects that perhaps connects the two is that they're, I mean, the two being Schindler and Helmut, is that they're both highly reductive in their approach to materials and even to form, but then really emotionally maximalist.
Yes, my gosh.
In what they're giving you.
Yes.
And that combination is very powerful.
It's very powerful, and I had to have a lie down afterwards, after I saw the show, because suddenly I wasn't myself. I had been in this atmosphere. And again, because it looks tiny when you come through, and then all of a sudden there's this immense volume of thinking with the sculptures and working in conjunction with the building. Another thing that I did then was walk around the garden quite a bit.
Right.
And I was like, wow, the next show with Helmut should be where he buries something in here or lets something grow, because you feel that he's in that direction, right? That it becomes more and more earthbound, something that is working in collaboration with the earth.
Yeah, I mean, he did actually talk about wanting to have pieces out there.
Oh gosh, you gotta do it.
And actually on the roof as well, which
Yeah.
wasn't possible, but the idea, obviously intrigued by the idea that the work could be subject to lens,
Yes.
and rooted in the ground that way. But also that it needn't be seen as well.
That's right.
That
You want to feel it.
that the audience
Yeah.
the audience does complete the work, but you know it can also complete itself in some
Yes.
way.
Yes. Wow. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Neville.
Thank you.
And we'll take some questions. I don't know what time it is, but the sun was starting to
Set.
set. Yeah.
Thank you both for such a delightful conversation.
Oh, good.
It's a real treat. Hilton, I was so taken by your use of the word vessel to
Yes.
describe this experience. And what I was intrigued by mostly was I totally understand and appreciate your use of the word to indicate ships sailing, possibly passing each other at night. But I was also intrigued by the other meaning of vessel,
Yes.
as in a container to be filled or to be empty.
Yes.
And so, Neville, I was curious to hear from you, with what were you seeking to fill or imbue this space through this show?
I think the space is already filled. I mean, I think you know it has the impress of human history. I was interested in the ghosts of what as much as interested in the form, I was interested in what took place here. You know, who ate and fucked and slept and laughed and cried, and you know the range of human emotion and possibility that went through it. And so I was more interested in a way that the sculptures might activate that kind of invisible content than trying to fill it with something.
Right, that it would have its own activity.
Yeah.
Any more folks? Don't be shy. Do it now while we're still here. There's a question over here. She's coming with the mic for you.
Thank you. Fellow Brit with brought up on an island with a potter for a parent. And it was just something that struck me as you said it, where you were very adamant that, I think it was your dad describes himself as an artisan rather than an artist. And I wondered what drives that separation and whether it was story. And I think, Hilton, you also said like art could be anything. But where does that distinction kind of lie for you guys?
I mean, for my father, it was an expression of modesty. I think. I mean, I think we thought there was artistry in it, but he was adamant that he was making plates, he was making tableware for his family and the rest of the island. So, but I think, you know, I don't think it was false modesty either. But I do think that what I took away from it was an idea that boundary between art and artisanal work, or even architecture, was permeable. And which island did you grow up on?
The Isle of Wight.
Oh, really? Yeah, okay. The Als City.
I think that for me it was that conversation with the docent. I wish I knew her name. It really changed my life, but I was very fortunate to have two great professors in college before I dropped out, one of whom is Kenneth Silver, and it was my first exposure to the ways in which the curatorial eye and the writer's eye had its own sensibility that could match or meet the work of art, and another great teacher that Ken turned me on to, Molly Nesbitt. And her book on Auger is mind-blowingly brilliant, but these were people who encouraged me not to be in the academy. They said, you can do everything that we're doing, but it would be a bad place for you because they would try to make you write in a different way. So just write and keep looking. So they were enormously influential, freeing people in my life. I love them still, and they're very funny, and you know, it was a real vocation for them to teach. Oh, sure. Do you have
how you handle the end of an exhibition, because it always feels to me I wanted to remain, and that's particularly true for Desert X, where I thought like there was some stuff from the years that would have been wonderful to stay in place.
Probably not very well. a little bit of postpartum distress. But I think you know, that's offset by the privilege that you have of spending all this time on the install. I mean, the amount of time spent sort of alone with these components, trying to configure what the conversation might be between them, is so privileged that it's hard to feel bad about it when it finally goes away.
That's a great question. That's a brilliant question, actually. I'm almost embarrassed to answer it because I can't really end the experience. So famously, you know, people will be coming through the door, and I'm still working on the type at the entrance hall because I can't leave it. And there's a brilliant woman, Britta Nelson. She's like the sort of exhibitions person at David Werner Gallery, and once I hear her heels coming down the hall, sort of like my mother, and I'm like, and she said, you have to stop now. Like, we're opening the doors in 5 minutes. I can't. It's a very difficult thing for me to let go because you're having this very intense love affair, really, with and in private, and with a lot of space, and people taking care of the love affair. It's very difficult to let go. But it's a great question. Thank you so much for coming.